The suburban streets of Clermont, Florida, just a short drive from the magic of Disney World, seemed like a haven of serenity. Families walked their dogs along manicured lawns, children played on quiet cul-de-sacs, and neighbors exchanged friendly waves. But in 2018, the tranquility of this picturesque community was shattered by a discovery that left residents in shock. A secret so dark, it had been hidden for years beneath the surface, literally. Buried under the backyard fire pit of a modest home was the body of Michael Shaver, a 36-year-old Disney World monorail technician. Known for his bright smile and unshakable work ethic, Michael was the last person anyone expected to vanish without a trace. His disappearance in late 2015 had raised few alarms, thanks to a carefully constructed web of lies by his wife, Laurie Shaver. Laurie wasn't just hiding her husband's whereabouts, she was entangled in a passionate affair with Brad Matthews, a charismatic local contractor. Their illicit romance began innocently enough but quickly spiraled into a vortex of betrayal, manipulation, and ultimately, murder. As Laurie pursued her desires with Brad, she plotted to eliminate the man standing in her way, her own husband. The story doesn't end with Michael's tragic death. It deepens into a tale of deceit as Laurie manipulated her own daughter to cover her tracks. What drove Laurie to turn her passion into a deadly weapon? How did her love affair become the centerpiece of a crime that shocked an entire community? The answers reveal a chilling portrait of a woman whose desires unraveled her family and turned a suburban dream into a nightmare. Born in 1979, Michael Shaver grew up in a modest, close-knit community in the Midwest. From an early age, he was known for his kind heart and relentless work ethic. Michael's dreams were simple but deeply meaningful. A stable job, a loving wife, happy children, and a home filled with laughter. When he moved to Florida to work at Disney World as a monorail technician, it felt like the perfect match for his optimistic nature. The job wasn't glamorous, but Michael loved it. He took pride in maintaining the iconic monorail system, knowing he was part of creating magical moments for visitors from around the world. At work, Michael was cherished for his dependability and his cheerful demeanor. He was the guy you could always count on, the one who would step in to help without hesitation. His life was built around making others happy, whether they were his co-workers, the guests at Disney, or the family he hoped to create. For Michael, happiness wasn't about grand gestures or material wealth. It was about stability, kindness, and sharing his love with those who mattered most. When Michael met Laurie in the mid-2000s, he believed he'd found the missing piece to his perfect life. She was charming, vibrant, and seemed to complement his quieter, more grounded personality. Their relationship moved quickly, fueled by mutual attraction and Michael's deep longing for a family of his own. By 2010, they were married in a modest ceremony, surrounded by family and friends. Michael was ready to pour everything into their life together. Laurie Shaver was the kind of person who could light up a room. At least, that's how she wanted to be seen. She had a way of making people feel special, of drawing them in with her energy and charisma. But those who got close to her often saw another side. Beneath the charm was a woman who craved control and wasn't afraid to manipulate situations to get what she wanted. Her relationships before Michael had been turbulent, marked by conflict and dissatisfaction. Laurie hated feeling constrained, whether financially, emotionally, or socially. She wanted more from life, and she wasn't shy about expressing that. At first, Michael seemed like the perfect partner for Laurie. He was stable, dependable, and deeply committed to their relationship. But Laurie's restless nature didn't stay quiet for long. As the years passed, she began to feel trapped in the modest life Michael worked so hard to build. Their home in Clermont, Florida, was cozy but far from the luxury Laurie dreamed of. Michael's Disney job, while steady and meaningful to him, wasn't enough for her. She began to see their life together not as a partnership but as a limitation, a life that fell short of her expectations. The early years of their marriage were happy enough. Laurie played the role of the supportive wife while Michael worked tirelessly to provide for their growing family. But as time went on, cracks began to show. Laurie's dissatisfaction grew into resentment. She started criticizing Michael more openly, pointing out his lack of ambition and blaming him for their financial constraints. Michael, ever the optimist, tried to make things work. He worked longer hours, suggested cutting back on expenses, and even proposed counseling. But none of it seemed to satisfy Laurie. In early 2015, Laurie met Brad Matthews, a contractor she hired to discuss renovations for their backyard. Brad was everything Michael wasn't. Rugged, bold, and effortlessly confident. He had a charisma that turned heads, and he wasn't shy about flirting. For Laurie, Brad was a breath of fresh air. A man who seemed to embody the excitement and passion she craved. Their interactions started innocently enough, with casual conversations about fire pits and landscaping, but the chemistry between them was undeniable. What began as light flirtation quickly escalated into something much more. Laurie found herself looking forward to her meetings with Brad, lingering a little too long when he came by to discuss plans. They began texting late into the night, their messages becoming increasingly personal and suggestive. Brad, who was no stranger to casual affairs, didn't hesitate to reciprocate. Laurie's frustrations with Michael became a regular topic in their conversations. She vented about feeling unappreciated and constrained, painting Michael as a man who didn't understand or support her. By the summer of 2015, Laurie and Brad's affair was in full swing. They met in secret, sneaking away to motels and sharing stolen moments whenever they could. Laurie, who had once been a devoted wife, now poured her energy into her relationship with Brad. For her, he represented freedom, a chance to escape the monotony of her marriage and create the life she believed she deserved. As Laurie's relationship with Brad intensified, her behavior toward Michael grew colder. She no longer tried to hide her disdain for him. Small criticisms turned into harsh accusations, and the warmth that had once defined their relationship was replaced with icy indifference. Michael, though deeply hurt, continued to try to save their marriage. He noticed Laurie's secrecy and suspected she was hiding something, but whenever he confronted her, she dismissed his concerns as paranoia. Laurie's resentment toward Michael only deepened. She began to see him not as her partner but as an obstacle, a barrier to her happiness with Brad. She confided in Brad about her frustrations, telling him that Michael was controlling and emotionally abusive. These claims weren't true, but they served Laurie's purpose, to justify her growing desire to remove Michael from her life entirely. By the fall of 2015, the tension in the Shaver household was unbearable. Michael, sensing that something was deeply wrong, suggested they take a break or consider counseling. Laurie refused. To her, there was no point in saving a marriage she no longer wanted. What Laurie wanted was Brad, a man who promised excitement, passion, and the life she believed she deserved. Michael was merely standing in the way. Laurie's mind began to race with possibilities. She had found the life she wanted with Brad, but Michael was still there, complicating everything. Divorce would be messy, expensive, and could lead to a custody battle over their children. Laurie didn't want the hassle, and she certainly didn't want to lose control. The more she thought about it, the more she resented Michael for still being part of her life. What had once been frustration turned into something far darker, a growing conviction that the only way to move forward was to eliminate him entirely. Brad, meanwhile, was unaware of the full extent of Laurie's plans. He was captivated by her but didn't realize how far she was willing to go to be with him. Laurie began testing his loyalty, dropping subtle hints about her unhappiness and suggesting that life would be easier if Michael wasn't in the picture. Brad, though uneasy, didn't push back. He didn't fully understand what Laurie was implying, or perhaps he chose not to see it. As Laurie's obsession with Brad deepened, Michael found himself more isolated than ever. He loved Laurie and their family, but he could feel her slipping away. Despite his best efforts, Michael couldn't save their marriage. Laurie had already made up her mind. For her, the life she wanted was just out of reach, and Michael was the only thing standing in the way. What Laurie did next would forever change their lives, and the quiet streets of Clermont, Florida, would never be the same. By the middle of 2015, Laurie Shaver's life no longer revolved around her husband or her family. It revolved around Brad Matthews. What began as a casual flirtation with the contractor she hired to discuss renovations for their backyard had turned into an all-consuming affair. Laurie wasn't just infatuated with Brad, she was obsessed. He was everything Michael wasn't. Rugged, bold, and unapologetically confident. For Laurie, Brad represented an escape from the monotony of her life, and she plunged headfirst into their relationship with reckless abandon. Brad, a man known for his easy charm and flirtatious nature, wasn't one to shy away from temptation. From the moment he met Laurie, he enjoyed the attention she gave him. The way she laughed a little too loudly at his jokes, leaned in a little too close during their conversations, and found reasons to call or text him after hours. What started as friendly banter soon evolved into something much more dangerous. Their texts became more frequent and intimate, filled with flirtation and thinly veiled promises of passion. Laurie and Brad both knew they were crossing a line, but neither seemed to care. For Laurie, Brad wasn't just an affair, he was an escape. He made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. With Brad, she didn't have to be the dutiful wife or the responsible mother. She could be wild, free, and selfish. She could be the center of attention, the object of someone's desire, without the burdens of everyday life dragging her down. The thrill of sneaking around, of sharing stolen moments and whispered secrets, fueled her like an addiction. Their relationship quickly escalated. Laurie began finding excuses to meet Brad in private, from fabricated errands to spontaneous work trips that she never explained to Michael. They met at motels under fake names, where their passion burned unchecked behind closed doors. Brad would run his hands through Laurie's hair, whispering promises of a future they could share, a future where she wouldn't have to answer to anyone. Laurie clung to those promises, feeding on the fantasy of a life without Michael. It wasn't just the physical aspect of the affair that consumed Laurie. Brad listened to her in a way she felt Michael never had. She vented to him about her frustrations with her marriage, her dissatisfaction with their modest lifestyle, and her belief that Michael was holding her back. Brad played the role of the understanding confidant, nodding along and reassuring Laurie that she deserved more. For Laurie, those words were intoxicating. She began to believe that Brad wasn't just a lover, he was her way out. But Brad wasn't entirely altruistic. He enjoyed the thrill of the affair as much as Laurie did. He loved the attention, the ego boost of being pursued by a married woman, and the excitement of their secret encounters. Still, Brad wasn't blind to the risks. He began encouraging Laurie to leave Michael, urging her to end her marriage and start fresh. Laurie, however, hesitated. Despite her growing disdain for Michael, she couldn't bring herself to sever ties completely. Divorce meant legal battles, financial complications, and custody disputes over their children, problems Laurie had no interest in facing. She wanted the life Brad promised her, but she didn't want the messy reality of what it would take to get there. Instead of making a clean break, Laurie doubled down on her affair. She spent more and more time with Brad, ignoring the growing rift in her marriage. She started coming home late, sometimes not at all, offering half-hearted excuses that Michael didn't believe. Her phone became an extension of her body, always clutched in her hand, buzzing with messages from Brad at all hours. Laurie stopped pretending to care about Michael's feelings. To her, he was no longer her husband, he was an obstacle. Their fantasies about a future together became a regular topic of conversation. They talked about where they would live, what their lives would look like, and how happy they would be once Michael was out of the picture. Laurie painted vivid pictures of the life she dreamed of. A bigger house, more money, and endless passion with Brad. But every time Brad asked why she hadn't left Michael yet, Laurie had an answer ready. She told him she needed time to figure out the logistics, to secure her finances, to protect her children. She assured him that leaving Michael was inevitable, but she just needed to be careful. Brad, for all his charm and bravado, began to feel uneasy. He didn't doubt Laurie's feelings for him, but her reluctance to leave Michael frustrated him. He started pressing her for answers, asking why she was still with a man she claimed to despise. Laurie responded by turning up the charm, showering Brad with affection and telling him everything he wanted to hear. "You're the only one who understands me," she'd say. "Michael doesn't love me like you do." Brad, blinded by his infatuation, believed her. As the weeks turned into months, Laurie's obsession with Brad deepened. She started envisioning a future where Michael simply didn't exist, not through divorce, but in a more permanent way. The idea was a fleeting thought at first, something she pushed aside as too extreme. But the more she fantasized about her life with Brad, the more Michael's presence felt unbearable. Laurie wasn't just unhappy, she was angry. Angry that Michael couldn't give her the life she wanted. Angry that he refused to let her go without a fight. And angry that he still had power over her. By the summer of 2015, Laurie's marriage was hanging by a thread. Michael knew something was wrong but couldn't fully grasp the depth of Laurie's betrayal. He still loved her, still wanted to believe their marriage could be saved. Laurie, on the other hand, had already made up her mind. In her heart, she was no longer Michael's wife. She was Brad's lover, and nothing else mattered. What Laurie didn't realize, or perhaps refused to admit, was how dangerous her obsession had become. Her affair with Brad wasn't just a distraction from her unhappy marriage. It was a catalyst for destruction. Laurie's fantasies about a life with Brad were no longer just dreams. They were plans. And Michael, the man who had once been the center of her world, was now standing in her way. The affair had taken over Laurie's life, transforming her into someone unrecognizable. She was no longer the devoted wife Michael had married or the mother her children depended on. She was a woman consumed by desire, willing to risk everything for a man who was never meant to stay. And in her desperation to hold on to Brad, Laurie was about to make a decision that would change everything and end Michael's life forever. By the summer of 2015, Michael Shaver's marriage to Laurie was crumbling, but he couldn't fully understand why. He was a man who believed in love, in family, and in the power of hard work to solve problems. For years, he had shouldered Laurie's criticisms, her dissatisfaction, and even her occasional coldness, always assuming that things would get better. But this time, something was different. Laurie wasn't just distant. She was acting like a stranger. It began with small changes. Laurie, who had always been attached to her family's routines, suddenly started disappearing for hours at a time with vague excuses. She had errands that couldn't wait, appointments that she didn't explain, and plans that didn't seem to include Michael or the kids. At first, Michael tried not to read too much into it. He told himself that Laurie was just going through a phase or that maybe she needed some space. But as the absences became more frequent, his unease grew. Michael couldn't ignore the other changes in Laurie's behavior. She was glued to her phone at all hours, texting furiously with a smile that she quickly wiped away when he walked into the room. Late at night, Michael would hear her phone buzzing, the screen lighting up with notifications she never let him see. When he asked who she was texting, Laurie would snap back with curt, dismissive answers. "It's just a friend," or "Why do you care?" When he pressed further, she accused him of being paranoid, of trying to control her. But Michael wasn't paranoid, he was paying attention. He started noticing patterns. Laurie's errands always coincided with the same days and times. Her appointments left her glowing when she returned, her hair slightly disheveled, and her mood lighter than it had been in years. Laurie's phone, once left casually on the kitchen counter, was now an extension of her body. She carried it everywhere, clutching it like a lifeline, and she had added a new passcode that Michael didn't know. One night, as Laurie showered, Michael's curiosity got the better of him. He picked up her phone, his hands trembling. The screen was locked, and the new passcode kept him out. That simple barrier felt like a wall between them, a confirmation that Laurie was hiding something from him. When he asked her about the new passcode later, Laurie shrugged it off, saying, "It's just for privacy. Don't you trust me?" Michael wanted to trust her, but trust doesn't survive on blind faith alone. The turning point came when Michael found the first undeniable clue. Laurie had left her laptop open on the dining table, logged into her email. Michael wasn't the type to snoop, but something about her recent behavior pushed him to look. What he found shattered his world. A string of messages between Laurie and an unfamiliar name, Brad Matthews. The messages were intimate, playful, and full of promises. Brad told Laurie how much he missed her, how he couldn't wait to see her again, and how beautiful she was. Laurie's replies were just as damning, filled with longing and affection. Michael's stomach churned as he read them, each word stabbing at the trust he had built with his wife over the years. When Laurie came home that evening, Michael confronted her. He demanded to know who Brad was and why they were exchanging such messages. Laurie didn't deny it outright. Instead, she turned defensive, accusing Michael of invading her privacy. "You're spying on me now? Is this who you've become?" she snapped, deflecting his questions with anger. When Michael pressed her for the truth, Laurie claimed Brad was just a friend, someone she could talk to when she felt overwhelmed. But the tone of the messages was undeniable, and Michael knew Laurie was lying. The confrontation escalated into a shouting match. Michael begged Laurie to come clean, to admit what he already knew, that she was having an affair. But Laurie wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Instead, she turned the blame onto him, saying, "Do you even know what it's like to be married to you? You're so focused on work. You don't even see me anymore." Her words stung, not because they were true, but because they were calculated to wound him. Michael was devastated, but he wasn't ready to give up on his marriage. He told Laurie they needed help, that they could go to counseling and work through their issues. He reminded her of their vows, of the family they had built together, of the love they had once shared. But Laurie wasn't interested in saving their marriage. She had already checked out. To her, Michael's pleas were pathetic, a reminder of why she had turned to Brad in the first place. The arguments became a regular occurrence. Michael would catch Laurie in another lie, about where she had been, who she was with, or why she hadn't come home on time, and Laurie would deflect, accuse, or simply shut him down. The warmth and intimacy that had once defined their relationship were gone, replaced by icy indifference on Laurie's part and desperation on Michael's. Still, Michael held onto hope. He convinced himself that Laurie's behavior was a phase, that she would come to her senses and realize what they were risking. He thought about their children, about the life they had built together, and he believed that deep down, Laurie wanted to protect that too. But Laurie had already decided that Michael didn't fit into her future. In her eyes, he was a roadblock, an obstacle standing between her and the life she dreamed of with Brad. And the more Michael tried to save their marriage, the more Laurie resented him for it. One night, after another explosive argument, Michael found himself alone in their bedroom, staring at the ceiling. Laurie had stormed out, refusing to talk to him, and the silence in the house was deafening. Michael couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing everything. He didn't just feel betrayed, he felt helpless. He had built his life around Laurie, trusted her implicitly, and now that trust was crumbling beneath him. But even in his heartbreak, Michael didn't give up. He loved his wife, even as she pulled away from him. He loved his children, and he wanted to protect them from the chaos brewing in their home. Michael believed that if he just tried hard enough, if he loved Laurie enough, he could bring her back to him. He didn't realize that Laurie had already made her choice, and that choice didn't include him. Laurie Shaver wasn't just a woman having an affair. She was a master manipulator, and Brad Matthews became her most useful pawn. From the moment their relationship turned physical, Laurie began laying the groundwork to ensure Brad would remain deeply entangled in her life. She wasn't just looking for a lover, she was crafting an ally, someone she could mold to fit her needs and, if necessary, someone she could use to erase Michael Shaver from her world entirely. Brad was rugged, confident, and, most importantly, infatuated with Laurie. At first, their affair was intoxicating. Clandestine meetings, passionate embraces, and whispered fantasies about the future. But Laurie quickly realized that Brad wasn't just a fling. He was the key to the life she wanted. Brad represented the freedom and excitement she craved, a life free of the monotony she claimed Michael had trapped her in. Yet, Brad was also a risk. His loyalty wasn't guaranteed, and Laurie knew she had to keep him emotionally tethered to her if she wanted him to stay in her orbit. To ensure that Brad remained devoted, Laurie painted a chilling picture of her life with Michael. She spun tales of emotional abuse and control, claiming that Michael was a cruel, oppressive husband who treated her like a prisoner. "You don't know what it's like living with him," she told Brad during one of their late-night rendezvous. "He controls everything. What I do, what I say, even how I think." In reality, Michael was none of those things. He was a kind and hard-working man, devoted to his family, but Laurie's stories served a purpose. They justified her affair and cast her as a victim in need of rescuing. Brad, captivated by Laurie's charm and seduced by the idea of being her hero, believed every word. He started seeing Michael not as Laurie's husband but as her tormentor, an obstacle to their happiness. Laurie fed this narrative with calculated precision, dropping just enough details to keep Brad's sympathy alive while ensuring he didn't question her motives. She portrayed herself as a woman stuck in a loveless marriage, trapped by a man who refused to let her go. And Brad, blinded by his feelings for Laurie, took the bait. Laurie's manipulation didn't stop there. She began testing Brad's loyalty, planting seeds of doubt about his commitment to their relationship. She would casually ask questions like, "Do you think you'd ever fight for me if it came to that? Or what would you do if Michael tried to hurt me?" These weren't innocent inquiries. They were calculated moves to gauge how far Brad was willing to go for her. Laurie wasn't just looking for love. She was looking for someone who would take her side, no matter the cost. As the months went on, Laurie started hinting at darker solutions to her problems. During one of their motel meetings, she told Brad, "Sometimes I feel like the only way out is if he just disappeared." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Brad, caught off guard, brushed it off as a moment of frustration. "Come on, don't say things like that," he replied, trying to laugh it away. But Laurie wasn't laughing. Her eyes held a seriousness that made Brad uncomfortable, though he didn't press her further. Laurie didn't need Brad to act immediately. She just needed to plant the idea. Over time, she became more explicit, telling Brad how scared she was of Michael, how she felt he was dangerous. She claimed Michael had threatened her during arguments, raising his voice and slamming doors. These fabrications were carefully designed to make Brad feel protective, to stoke his anger toward Michael, and to justify Laurie's growing desperation. In reality, Michael had never been violent or threatening. He was a man trying to hold his family together, but Laurie's lies painted him as a monster. Brad, who saw himself as Laurie's savior, became increasingly invested in the idea that he needed to protect her. He started talking about ways to help Laurie, offering to support her financially if she left Michael and even suggesting they run away together. But Laurie always had an excuse. "I can't leave yet," she'd say. "Michael would ruin me in court. He'd take the kids, the house, everything. I'd have nothing." Brad didn't realize that Laurie wasn't interested in divorce. Divorce was messy, complicated, and would leave her without the financial stability Michael provided. Laurie wanted a clean break, a life where Michael simply no longer existed. And she wanted Brad to help her get there. To keep Brad on her side, Laurie played the role of the devoted lover. She showered him with affection, telling him how much she needed him, how he was the only person who truly understood her. She made him feel indispensable, feeding his ego and deepening his emotional investment. At the same time, she kept Michael in the shadows of their conversations, a constant reminder of the threat that loomed over their happiness. Laurie's manipulation reached its peak when she began subtly suggesting that Michael's disappearance might be the only solution. During one particularly heated conversation with Brad, she said, "I've tried everything, talking to him, reasoning with him, but he won't listen. He won't let me go. I don't know what else to do." Her voice trembled with feigned helplessness, her eyes filling with fake tears. Brad, caught between his desire to help Laurie and his own moral boundaries, tried to comfort her. "We'll figure something out," he promised, though the unease in his voice was clear. But Laurie wasn't interested in vague reassurances. She needed Brad to be fully committed to her, to see Michael as an enemy who needed to be eliminated. She started framing her situation in life-or-death terms, telling Brad that Michael was dangerous and that she didn't feel safe in her own home. "I don't know what he's capable of," she said one night, her voice barely above a whisper. "If something happens to me, promise you'll protect me." Brad, though uneasy, couldn't see through Laurie's facade. He didn't realize that her stories were carefully constructed lies designed to manipulate him. He believed he was protecting the woman he loved, but in reality, he was being pulled deeper into a plan he didn't fully understand. Laurie's manipulation wasn't just about convincing Brad to take her side, it was about control. She needed to ensure that Brad would support her no matter what, that he would see her as a victim worth fighting for. She painted Michael as a villain and herself as a damsel in distress, creating a narrative that justified her increasingly dark thoughts. Brad was her tool, her insurance policy, and her way out. And as Laurie's lies grew more elaborate, Brad became more entangled in her web, unable to see the danger lurking just beneath the surface. Laurie had no intention of leaving Michael the way Brad thought she would. She wasn't looking for freedom through divorce. She was looking for freedom through elimination. And Brad, blinded by love and manipulated into believing her lies, was unwittingly helping her lay the groundwork for a crime that would shock everyone. By November 2015, the tension in the Shaver household was unbearable. Laurie's double life was closing in on her, and Michael was no longer the naive, hopeful husband who thought their marriage could be saved. He had spent months watching the woman he loved slip further and further away, her lies growing more blatant, her absences more frequent, and her disdain for him more obvious. Laurie didn't bother hiding her contempt anymore. To her, Michael wasn't just a husband she no longer loved. He was the obstacle standing in the way of the life she fantasized about with Brad Matthews. Michael had tried everything to fix their marriage. He suggested counseling, begged Laurie to be honest with him, and even confronted her about the affair he already knew she was having. But Laurie had no interest in reconciliation. She dismissed his pleas with icy indifference, throwing his words back at him with sharp, cutting remarks. "You're pathetic, Michael," she told him during one argument. "Do you think begging is going to make me love you again?" Michael's heartbreak was evident, but with every insult, every cold glare, and every missed night Laurie spent away from home, his heartbreak turned into resolve. He couldn't keep pretending their marriage was salvageable. Laurie wasn't the woman he married. She wasn't the loving partner he had built a family with. She was someone else entirely now. Someone he didn't recognize, someone dangerous. On November 16, 2015, Michael decided it was time to act. He had spoken to a lawyer and gathered evidence of Laurie's affair, including messages between her and Brad Matthews that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. He was ready to file for divorce, but this wasn't just about ending his marriage. Michael was determined to protect his children. He told close friends that he feared what Laurie's instability might mean for them, and he knew he needed to fight for full custody. That evening, Michael came home early, his jaw set and his mind made up. He found Laurie in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone with a smirk on her face. The sight of her so openly detached from their family, so comfortable in her deception, ignited a fire inside him. He couldn't stay silent anymore. "We need to talk," Michael said, his voice steady but firm. Laurie barely looked up from her phone. "I'm busy," she replied flatly. But Michael wasn't backing down. He walked over, taking the phone from her hands and placing it on the counter. "No, Laurie. We need to talk now." Laurie's eyes narrowed, her irritation evident. "What's your problem, Michael? You've been acting like a jealous lunatic for months." Michael took a deep breath, his hands shaking slightly, though he tried to hide it. "I know about Brad," he said finally, the words heavy with a mixture of anger and sadness. "I know about everything. The texts, the meetings, all of it." Laurie didn't flinch. She crossed her arms, leaning back against the counter with a smirk that made Michael's stomach turn. "So what? You've been spying on me now? What's the plan, Michael? You think you're going to guilt me into staying with you?" Michael's voice rose, the frustration of months of lies and betrayal finally boiling over. "You don't even care, do you? You don't care about me, about this family, about our kids. You've been lying to all of us." Laurie rolled her eyes, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, spare me the lecture, Michael. You're just mad because I found someone who actually makes me happy." Michael's hands clenched into fists at his sides, though he kept his voice as calm as he could. "I talked to a lawyer today," he said, watching Laurie's expression shift ever so slightly. For the first time, her smirk faltered. "I'm filing for divorce, Laurie. And I'm fighting for full custody of the kids." Laurie's reaction was instant. Her face twisted in fury, her voice rising to a near scream. "You think you're going to take my kids away from me? Over my dead body, Michael?" She stepped closer to him, her eyes blazing. You don't have a clue what you're doing. You're going to regret this. Michael didn't back down. I'm doing what's best for them, he said firmly. They deserve better than this. Better than seeing their mother sneaking around and lying. Better than being in a house filled with this kind of tension. Laurie's fury only grew. You're not some saint, Michael. Don't act like you're perfect. You're just jealous that I don't love you anymore. That I've found someone better. The words hit Michael like a slap in the face, but he didn't let it show. He knew Laurie was trying to provoke him, to bait him into an argument that she could twist in her favor later. Instead, he stepped back, his voice low but steady. This isn't about you and Brad. This is about our kids. And I won't let them grow up in this kind of environment. Laurie's face darkened, her expression shifting from anger to something colder, more calculating. You don't know what you're starting, she said quietly, her voice carrying a dangerous edge. You think you can just walk away and take everything? You're a fool, Michael. Michael turned to leave the room, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt a mix of relief and dread. Relief that he had finally taken a stand, dread at the reality of what was to come. As he reached the door, Laurie's voice stopped him. If you do this, Michael, you won't just lose me. You'll lose everything. The words sent a chill down his spine, but he didn't respond. He walked away, leaving Laurie alone in the kitchen. What Michael didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Laurie wasn't just angry. She was plotting. In her mind, Michael's defiance wasn't just a threat to her control. It was a declaration of war. And Laurie wasn't about to lose. That night, as Michael slept, Laurie sat awake, her thoughts racing. The idea of losing her children, her house, and the life she had built with Brad was unbearable. She couldn't let it happen. Divorce wasn't an option. A custody battle wasn't an option. For Laurie, there was only one solution. Michael had to be removed, permanently. The last confrontation between Michael and Laurie wasn't just a fight between a husband and wife. It was the beginning of the end. For Michael, it was a stand for his family and his values. For Laurie, it was a line drawn in the sand. A challenge she wasn't willing to lose. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Michael's fate had already been sealed in Laurie's mind. She had made her decision, and nothing was going to stop her. November 16, 2015, began as an ordinary day in the Shaver household, but it would end in unimaginable tragedy. By this point, the tension between Laurie and Michael had reached its breaking point. Michael, armed with evidence of Laurie's affair and determined to protect his children, had made it clear he was filing for divorce and seeking full custody. For Laurie, this was the final straw. Divorce meant not only losing control over her family, but also losing the financial stability Michael provided and the idyllic life she fantasized about with Brad Matthews. That night, Laurie decided Michael had to be eliminated. The argument began in the living room, their voices escalating as accusations flew back and forth. Michael, tired and emotionally drained, told Laurie he wasn't going to argue anymore. "This is done, Laurie," he said, turning to leave the room. But Laurie wasn't ready to let him go. Not like that. As Michael walked away, she grabbed a gun she had stashed nearby. Whether the weapon had been placed there intentionally or was a last-minute decision, one thing was clear. Laurie had made up her mind. Michael didn't see it coming. As he walked toward the hallway, Laurie raised the gun and fired. The bullet struck the back of his head, a calculated shot designed to ensure he wouldn't survive. Michael collapsed instantly, his body crumpling to the floor. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the house, shattering the silence and marking the end of Michael's life. Laurie stood frozen for a moment, the reality of what she'd done sinking in. But instead of panic, her mind shifted into survival mode. She couldn't let anyone find out what had happened. Not the neighbors, not the police, and certainly not Brad. The image of her children flashed through her mind, but even that wasn't enough to make her stop and reconsider. Laurie didn't see Michael as the father of her children or the man she once loved. In that moment, he was just a problem she had solved. The crime scene was brutal yet eerily quiet. Blood pooled beneath Michael's lifeless body, seeping into the carpet. His eyes were still open, staring blankly at nothing. The air smelled of gunpowder and death, and the house, which had once been filled with laughter and life, now felt cold and hollow. Laurie stood over Michael's body, breathing heavily as her mind raced. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply stared, calculating her next move. Her hands trembling but her thoughts sharp, Laurie began to clean up. She knew the first step was to move Michael's body before anyone could see it. Dragging his lifeless form was harder than she expected. Michael had always been a sturdy man, and his dead weight was overwhelming. But Laurie, driven by desperation, managed to move him out of sight. She didn't care about the trail of blood she left behind. She would deal with that later. The house was silent except for the sound of Laurie's labored breathing. She knew she needed help, but there was only one person she trusted to call. Picking up her phone, her blood-streaked fingers trembling, Laurie dialed Brad Matthews. It was time to bring him into the nightmare she had just created. After pulling the trigger, Laurie Shaver didn't hesitate. Standing over her husband's lifeless body, she reached for her phone with blood-streaked hands. She knew she couldn't handle this alone. The only person she trusted, or perhaps the only person she could manipulate into helping, was Brad Matthews, her lover and supposed escape from the life she had just destroyed. Laurie's voice was shaky but controlled when Brad answered the call. "Brad, I need you," she said, her words loaded with urgency. "Something happened. I didn't have a choice. Michael is dead." The weight of her statement hit Brad like a truck, and for a moment, he was silent on the other end of the line, struggling to process what he'd just heard. "What do you mean, dead?" Brad finally managed, his voice a mixture of shock and disbelief. Laurie launched into a story, one carefully designed to elicit his sympathy and keep him from abandoning her. She claimed that Michael had lost it, that he had been aggressive during their argument and she'd acted in self-defense. "He was going to hurt me," she insisted, her voice trembling for effect. "I didn't know what else to do." Brad, stunned and unprepared for such a revelation, tried to process her words. He had always believed Laurie's stories about Michael being abusive and controlling, but this was something else entirely. You shot him." Brad stammered, the disbelief clear in his voice. Laurie didn't answer directly. Instead, she doubled down on her narrative, painting herself as a victim in a desperate situation. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she said, feigning remorse. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." Brad was horrified. He had never imagined their affair would lead to something like this. Despite the fantasies they had shared about a future together, he wasn't prepared to deal with the aftermath of a murder. Laurie's desperation was palpable, and she begged him to come over, to help her figure out what to do next. "I need you, Brad," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "I can't do this alone." For a brief moment, Brad considered it. Laurie had a way of pulling him in, of making him feel responsible for her. But the gravity of the situation was too much. He wasn't just risking his relationship or his reputation. He was risking his freedom. I can't, Laurie," Brad said finally, his voice filled with panic. "I can't be involved in this. Do you realize what you're asking me?" Laurie didn't let up. She pressed him harder, trying to exploit his feelings for her. "I didn't know who else to call," she said, her tone shifting to one of vulnerability. "I thought you cared about me. I thought you'd help me when I needed you the most." But Brad wasn't budging. The reality of the situation was sinking in, and he realized how dangerous Laurie's request truly was. "Laurie, listen to me," Brad said, trying to stay calm. "You need to call the police. Tell them what happened. If it was self-defense, they'll understand." But Laurie wasn't interested in that option. "You don't get it," she snapped. "They'll never believe me. Michael was the perfect husband to everyone else. I'll go to prison. Brad, do you want that for me? Do you want me to lose everything?" Brad's heart raced as Laurie continued to push. He wanted to hang up, to sever ties with the mess she had created, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Instead, he made a weak promise to call her back and ended the call, his mind spinning. In the hours that followed, Laurie tried reaching out to Brad again, but he didn't answer. She sent him messages, alternating between begging for help and accusing him of abandoning her. "I thought you loved me," one message read. "I guess I was wrong." Brad, terrified of being implicated in the crime, ignored her calls and texts, choosing self-preservation over loyalty to the woman who had dragged him into this nightmare. For Laurie, Brad's refusal to help was a betrayal. She had counted on him to be her partner, her savior, and now he was backing out when she needed him the most. But instead of panicking, Laurie's mind turned to damage control. If Brad wouldn't help her, she would handle this herself. And she would make sure no one, especially Brad, could tie her to what she had done. Brad's silence didn't protect him entirely, though. From that moment on, Laurie kept him in her pocket, threatening to implicate him if the truth ever came out. "You were part of this," she reminded him in a chilling message weeks later. "Don't forget that." Brad, terrified of what Laurie might say or do, distanced himself as much as possible, but the shadow of the murder lingered over him, a constant reminder of the line he had allowed himself to cross. For Laurie, Brad's reluctance was a disappointment, but not a deterrent. She was now fully committed to covering up her crime, and she would stop at nothing to protect herself, even if it meant burying the truth, along with Michael's body. With Michael's lifeless body lying on the floor and Brad Matthews refusing to help, Laurie Shaver was left alone to deal with the horrifying aftermath of her actions. But Laurie wasn't the kind of person to crumble under pressure. She was calculating, cold, and determined to protect herself at all costs. What unfolded next was a chilling demonstration of her ability to think on her feet and manipulate the situation to her advantage. Laurie didn't waste time. She knew the first priority was to eliminate any immediate evidence of the crime. Dragging Michael's body was physically grueling, but Laurie's desperation gave her the strength to move him. She hauled his lifeless form to the backyard, leaving a macabre trail of blood in her wake. Every sound, every creak of the house, made her flinch. If the neighbors heard something or saw her, it would all be over. The backyard had always been Laurie's domain, the place where she envisioned the luxurious renovations Brad had once promised her. It was ironic, in a twisted way, that the fire pit she and Brad had casually discussed during their affair would now become the centerpiece of her gruesome plan. Laurie chose the fire pit as the burial site for one simple reason. It was convenient and easy to conceal. It was a symbol of her future with Brad, but now it would become a tomb for Michael. Laurie worked tirelessly that night. She wrapped Michael's body to prevent the blood from seeping into the ground and began digging. Every shovel full of dirt was a reminder of the life she had just destroyed, but Laurie didn't stop. She couldn't. By the time the sun began to rise, Michael's body was buried beneath the spot where the fire pit would soon be built. But Laurie's plan didn't stop with the burial. To ensure that no one would question Michael's sudden disappearance, she needed to craft a story, a narrative that would explain his absence and keep suspicions at bay. Laurie began by impersonating Michael online. She logged into his social media accounts, posting sporadic updates that made it seem like he had left voluntarily. "Taking some time for myself," one post read. "Need to clear my head." To anyone who knew Michael, the updates seemed out of character, but they were just convincing enough to prevent immediate alarm. Over the next few weeks, Laurie took steps to erase Michael's presence from their lives. She drained his bank accounts, sold his belongings, and even pawned off items with sentimental value. Friends and co-workers who reached out to Michael were met with silence or vague excuses from Laurie. "He's traveling," she told them. "He just needs some space." Most people accepted her explanations, though a few began to grow suspicious. Laurie's ultimate move in her cover-up was as bold as it was horrifying. She married Brad Matthews near the very fire pit that now concealed Michael's body. The ceremony was small, almost casual, with only a few witnesses. To those in attendance, Laurie seemed radiant, happier than she had been in years. No one suspected that beneath the surface of her newlywed glow lay the truth of what she had done. For 2 years, Laurie maintained the illusion of a life that had moved on without Michael. She used his money to fund her new lifestyle, posting pictures of vacations, outings, and her seemingly blissful new relationship with Brad. The fire pit, now completed and adorned with chairs and decorative stones, became a focal point of the backyard, a chilling reminder of the secret buried just beneath the surface. But Laurie's confidence in her cover-up was ultimately her undoing. As time passed, cracks began to show. Friends and family who knew Michael became increasingly suspicious of his prolonged silence. A concerned friend, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong, eventually requested a welfare check on Michael in 2018. When the police arrived and began asking questions, Laurie's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. It was the fire pit that gave her away. Ground-penetrating radar revealed anomalies beneath the surface, leading investigators to dig. What they uncovered was a grim reminder of the lengths Laurie had gone to protect herself. Michael's body, buried in the very place where Laurie and Brad had celebrated their new life together, told the story she had tried so desperately to hide. Laurie Shaver's cover-up was both audacious and chilling, a testament to her cold calculation and complete lack of remorse. For 2 years, she lived as though nothing had happened, erasing Michael's existence piece by piece. But no amount of lies, manipulation, or carefully crafted stories could keep the truth buried forever. When the fire pit was uncovered, so was Laurie's crime, and the twisted reality of what she had done finally came to light. By February 2018, over 2 years had passed since anyone had last seen Michael Shaver alive. His sudden disappearance in late 2015 had initially raised little alarm. Laurie Shaver, his wife, had woven an intricate web of lies to explain his absence, convincing those around her that Michael had left voluntarily to find himself or to take a break from family life. Most people, though skeptical, accepted her story at face value. After all, Laurie was a charismatic woman, and Michael was known for his quiet and unassuming nature. But for those who truly knew him, the silence was deafening. One of Michael's closest friends, a co-worker at Disney World, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Michael wasn't the type to vanish without a word, let alone cut ties with his friends and family. Over the years, this friend had made multiple attempts to contact Michael, leaving messages, calling his phone, and even reaching out to Laurie. Each time, Laurie offered a rehearsed excuse. His traveling, she'd say. His staying with a friend for a while. He just needs some time. But the longer Michael stayed gone, the harder it was to believe her. Finally, in February 2018, this friend took action. Unable to shake the suspicion that Michael's disappearance wasn't as innocent as Laurie claimed, they contacted the police and requested a welfare check. The call marked the beginning of the end for Laurie's carefully constructed facade. When deputies arrived at Laurie's Clermont, Florida, home, they were greeted by a woman who appeared calm and confident. Laurie stuck to her story, claiming that Michael had left on his own and had no interest in returning. He just needed to get away, she said, her tone almost dismissive. She insisted there was no reason to worry, offering vague details about Michael's supposed whereabouts. But something about her demeanor raised red flags. She wasn't a grieving wife or a concerned partner. She was defensive, evasive, and almost annoyed by the intrusion. The deputies pressed further, asking when Laurie had last seen Michael and why he hadn't contacted anyone in over 2 years. Laurie's answers were vague and inconsistent, and her story began to unravel under even the most basic scrutiny. Sensing that something wasn't right, the deputies decided to search the property. Laurie, though visibly tense, allowed them access, perhaps believing that her secret was safe. She had spent years building her cover story, and the fire pit, a seemingly innocuous feature of the backyard, was the last place anyone would think to look. But the deputies weren't taking any chances. Armed with ground-penetrating radar, they began scanning the backyard for anomalies. As the device passed over the fire pit, it detected something unusual beneath the surface, a disturbance in the soil that suggested recent excavation. The deputies, now certain they were onto something, began digging. What they found would send shockwaves through the quiet suburban community. Beneath the fire pit, wrapped in a makeshift covering, were human remains. The discovery was both grim and damning. Michael's body, buried in the very place Laurie had celebrated her new life with Brad Matthews, had been hidden there for over 2 years. The positioning of the remains and the condition of the burial site made it clear that this was no accident. It was a deliberate and calculated act to conceal a murder. Word of the discovery spread quickly, and the neighborhood, once a picturesque and peaceful slice of suburbia, became the center of a criminal investigation. Reporters descended on the area, neighbors gathered in hushed groups, and the public began piecing together the horrifying implications of what had happened. Michael Shaver, the kind and dependable Disney World technician, hadn't vanished of his own accord. He had been murdered, his body buried just steps from the home he had worked so hard to provide for his family. For the investigators, the discovery of Michael's body was only the beginning. They knew they had uncovered a crime scene, but they still needed to untangle the web of lies Laurie had spun and determine exactly what had happened in the years since Michael's death. The fire pit, once a symbol of suburban normalcy, was now a damning piece of evidence, a silent witness to the dark secrets Laurie had tried so desperately to bury. And as investigators began to dig deeper, both figuratively and literally, they would uncover a story more twisted and horrifying than anyone could have imagined. As investigators began piecing together the events surrounding Michael Shaver's disappearance, Laurie Shaver's carefully constructed facade started to crumble. For over 2 years, Laurie had lived as though nothing had happened. She had told friends, neighbors, and even Michael's co-workers that he had left voluntarily to clear his head or figure things out. To anyone who questioned why they hadn't heard from him directly, Laurie offered a mix of vague excuses and outright lies. His staying with a friend, she'd say, or he's just not ready to talk to anyone yet. But as investigators delved deeper into Laurie's life, it became evident that her version of events didn't hold up under scrutiny. The first crack in Laurie's story came with her inability to provide any real proof of Michael's whereabouts. When asked if she had contact information for him, Laurie stumbled. She claimed they hadn't spoken in months and that Michael had cut ties with her and the kids. When pressed about why she hadn't reported him missing, Laurie doubled down on her narrative, insisting he had left on his own and didn't want to be found. Her dismissive attitude raised red flags for investigators, who began to suspect there was more to the story than Laurie was letting on. As they dug deeper, investigators uncovered damning evidence of Laurie's financial exploitation of Michael's assets. Bank records revealed that Laurie had drained Michael's accounts shortly after his disappearance, using the money to fund her own lifestyle. She sold his belongings, including tools, electronics, and other items with sentimental value, all while pretending that Michael had willingly left them behind. Laurie's boldest move, however, was her impersonation of Michael on social media. She had posted sporadic updates from his accounts, making it seem as though Michael was alive and well, even engaging with acquaintances who reached out to check on him. Taking some time for myself, one post read, "Needed a break from everything." As investigators questioned Brad, his initial reluctance to cooperate gave way to a flood of revelations. Brad admitted to the affair, detailing how Laurie had painted Michael as a cruel and overbearing husband. He described how Laurie had used these stories to justify her actions, portraying herself as a woman desperate to escape an oppressive marriage. But as Brad recounted his conversations with Laurie, a darker picture emerged. He revealed how Laurie had hinted at wanting Michael out of the way and how she had tried to involve him in her schemes, though he had refused to participate. Brad's testimony was a turning point in the investigation. It not only exposed Laurie's manipulative behavior, but also provided insight into her mindset leading up to the murder. Brad described how Laurie had alternated between playing the victim and using her charm to keep him emotionally tethered to her. He admitted that he had believed her lies at the time, but in hindsight, he realized how carefully she had constructed her narrative to manipulate him. As the investigation progressed, forensic evidence began to build a case against Laurie. The most damning piece of evidence was the discovery of Michael's body beneath the backyard fire pit. The condition of the burial site and the positioning of the remains suggested a deliberate effort to conceal the crime. Forensic analysis confirmed that Michael had died from a gunshot wound to the back of the head, a calculated execution rather than an act of self-defense, as Laurie would later claim. Further evidence tied Laurie directly to the murder weapon. Investigators recovered a gun registered in Laurie's name, and ballistic testing confirmed it was the weapon used to kill Michael. Inconsistencies in Laurie's statements about the gun, first claiming it had been stolen, then saying she had misplaced it, only deepened suspicions. The location of the gun, found hidden in a storage space within the home, further implicated Laurie in the crime. Digital evidence also played a crucial role in unraveling Laurie's lies. Investigators uncovered text messages and emails between Laurie and Brad that revealed her growing disdain for Michael and her desire to be with Brad at any cost. In one particularly chilling exchange, Laurie wrote, "Sometimes I wish he would just disappear. Life would be so much easier without him." While Brad dismissed these comments as venting at the time, they now took on a much darker significance. Laurie's financial exploitation of Michael's assets provided additional proof of her motives. Bank records showed that Laurie had systematically emptied Michael's accounts in the months following his disappearance, using the money to fund vacations, home improvements, and other personal expenses. Combined with her efforts to sell his belongings and impersonate him on social media, the evidence painted a picture of a woman who had meticulously planned to erase Michael from her life while benefiting financially from his absence. As investigators compiled their findings, Laurie's web of lies began to collapse. Her claims of self-defense fell apart under scrutiny, and the evidence overwhelmingly pointed to premeditation. The discovery of Michael's body, the financial records, the murder weapon, and Brad's testimony created a case so damning that Laurie could no longer maintain her charade. The woman who had spent years manipulating those around her now found herself at the center of a criminal investigation, with nowhere left to hide. The investigation into Michael Shaver's disappearance and death exposed Laurie's true nature, a woman driven by greed, selfishness, and an unrelenting desire for control. Her lies, once so convincing, were now unraveling before her eyes, leaving behind a trail of betrayal, manipulation, and, ultimately, murder. Laurie Shaver's trial began in January 2024, nearly a decade after she pulled the trigger and set into motion a chilling series of events that ended with Michael Shaver buried beneath their backyard fire pit. The courtroom, packed with reporters, family members, and onlookers, became the stage for a drama that had gripped not just Clermont, Florida, but the nation. The trial offered a rare glimpse into a tangled web of betrayal, manipulation, and murder. The prosecution wasted no time painting Laurie as a cold-blooded killer who had meticulously planned her husband's death. They argued that Laurie was motivated by two powerful and destructive forces: greed and lust. Laurie's affair with Brad Matthews, they contended, wasn't just a fling, it was the fuel that ignited her deadly plan. The prosecution described Laurie as a manipulative woman who saw Michael as an obstacle to her fantasies of freedom and luxury with Brad. Divorce wasn't an option for Laurie, they argued, because it would mean financial complications, custody battles, and losing the control she valued so deeply. For Laurie, Michael had to be erased. The centerpiece of the prosecution's case was Laurie's affair with Brad Matthews. Prosecutors highlighted the incriminating text messages and emails between Laurie and Brad, showcasing how their relationship had consumed her life in the months leading up to the murder. In one particularly damning message, Laurie wrote, "I can't stand it anymore. He's ruining everything. I just want him gone." The prosecution argued that these messages were evidence of premeditation, proving that Laurie didn't act in self-defense, as she would claim, but had planned Michael's death long before the fatal shot was fired. One of the most anticipated moments of the trial came when Brad Matthews took the stand. Brad, now a shell of the confident and charismatic contractor he once was, testified reluctantly. His name had been dragged through the mud in the years since Michael's disappearance, and though he was not charged with any crimes, the shadow of the affair and its connection to the murder had destroyed his reputation. Under questioning from the prosecution, Brad admitted to his affair with Laurie, detailing how their relationship began and how she had painted Michael as a controlling and abusive husband. "She told me she was miserable," Brad said, his voice heavy with regret. "She said Michael made her feel trapped, like she couldn't breathe." When asked if he believed Laurie's claims at the time, Brad hesitated. "I did," he said finally. "I thought I was helping her. I thought she needed someone to save her." The prosecution pressed Brad further, asking if Laurie had ever mentioned wanting Michael out of the way. Brad nodded, his discomfort palpable. "She hinted at it," he admitted. "She said things like, 'Life would be so much easier without him,' but I thought she was just venting. I didn't think she'd actually do it." Brad denied any involvement in the murder, insisting that he had no knowledge of Laurie's plan to kill Michael. However, his testimony painted a damning picture of Laurie as a manipulative woman who had used her relationship with Brad to justify and fuel her actions. The prosecution used Brad's words to bolster their case, arguing that Laurie's lies about Michael's behavior were part of a calculated effort to garner sympathy and deflect suspicion. The most heartbreaking moment of the trial came when Laurie's teenage daughter took the stand. Now older and visibly shaken, she recounted the years of manipulation and fear she had endured at the hands of her mother. Her testimony revealed the depths of Laurie's cruelty and her willingness to involve her own child in the cover-up of Michael's murder. The daughter described how Laurie had coerced her into taking partial blame for the crime, claiming it was an act of self-defense to protect Laurie from Michael. She told me that if anyone found out, we'd both go to jail, the daughter said, her voice trembling. I was scared. I didn't know what to do. The courtroom was silent as she described the psychological toll of living with Laurie's lies. She made me feel like it was my fault, the daughter said, tears streaming down her face. She said we had to stick together, that no one would believe us if we told the truth. Her testimony was a devastating blow to Laurie's defense. It not only undermined Laurie's claims of self-defense but also highlighted her willingness to manipulate and exploit her own child to save herself. The emotional impact of the daughter's words was evident in the faces of the jurors, many of whom wiped away tears as they listened. After weeks of testimony, the case was handed to the jury. The evidence against Laurie was overwhelming. The discovery of Michael's body, the forensic link to the murder weapon, the damning text messages, and the testimony from Brad and Laurie's daughter all painted a clear picture of a premeditated crime. The jury deliberated for less than a day before reaching a unanimous verdict. On February 15, 2024, Laurie Shaver was found guilty of second-degree murder. As the verdict was read, Laurie sat stone-faced, showing no visible emotion. For Michael's family, the verdict was a bittersweet moment. They had waited nearly a decade for justice, and while Laurie's conviction brought some closure, it couldn't bring Michael back. During sentencing, Michael's sister addressed the court, speaking directly to Laurie. You took a good man from this world, she said, her voice filled with emotion. Michael didn't deserve what you did to him, and will never forgive you for the pain you caused. The judge sentenced Laurie to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was led away in handcuffs, her future sealed by the crimes she had committed and the lies she had told to cover them up. For Michael's family, Laurie's conviction was a long-awaited validation of the truth they had known all along. But the pain of his loss would never fade. Laurie's actions had torn apart a family, shattered the innocence of her children, and left a permanent scar on the community. Justice had been served, but the wounds she had inflicted would take a lifetime to heal. Though Brad Matthews avoided criminal charges in Michael Shaver's murder, his life was irreparably damaged by the scandal. Once a respected contractor, Brad became a pariah in his community, with his affair with Laurie Shaver sensationalized in the media and forever linked to Michael's death. His business collapsed as clients distanced themselves, and he eventually left Clermont, retreating into obscurity under the weight of shame and regret. Laurie's teenage daughter faced a deeply painful journey of recovery after years of manipulation by her mother, including being coerced into covering up the crime. With the support of Michael's family, who provided a stable and loving environment, and the help of therapy, she began to heal and later used her experiences to advocate for children affected by toxic family dynamics. Michael's family, though devastated, honored his memory through a scholarship supporting technical careers and became vocal advocates for domestic violence awareness, turning their pain into meaningful action. Meanwhile, the community of Clermont struggled to reconcile the darkness hidden behind the Shavers' seemingly perfect image. The shocking crime left neighbors questioning their ability to recognize warning signs, and Michael's story became a cautionary tale about the unseen tragedies that can lurk within suburban life.